Okay, it's Saturday evening and I'm taking a break from work and training and I'm going to watch a movie. Loads of you write to me all the time with all manner of questions about training and performance in climbing, and I've had lots and lots of emails over the past week and a half about a movie called The Game Changers. If you haven't heard of it, The Game Changers is a documentary that's just come out on Netflix and other platforms, which apparently promotes the idea that switching to a plant-based diet, whatever that means, will improve your sport performance. And loads of you have messaged this week to ask me, well, is that true? What do you think? Do you think that the movie is good, and do you think that switching to a plant-based diet will improve your sport performance? I do have a view on this, and actually I am preparing another vlog episode, quite a long and detailed one, about why I'm not vegan myself. But since so many of you have asked this week, I thought I would sit down and watch the film and see what it says and just give some quick thoughts. This episode is not meant to be a thorough review of all the references and ideas that are in the film. I just want to have a look through it, see what the ideas and the underlying data are, and give a general impression of what I think of the movie. I've watched most of the high profile documentaries on nutrition that have come out in Netflix over the past few years, and they're almost universally disappointing. They almost universally distort the scientific literature in favour of some agenda that they have. But you have to give these films a chance. Maybe this one will be different, maybe this one will be better. I have a few things that I would like to see from this film. The subtitle of the film is Fueled by the Truth, not cheesy at all, but I would like to see how it deals with some of the evidence both apparently in favour of, and also apparently not in favour of switching to plant-based, especially vegan diets, especially in light of two large meta-analyses that have just come out in the past few months that have concluded that there is no evidence for harm from eating either red meat or processed meat for a whole range of health outcomes. I also really hope that they have more scientific rigour generally. There's a series of classic studies that are really form the pillar of the argument put forward by the vegan movement. And really these fall into two categories. The first are trials such as the Dean Ornish's trial, which is referenced all the time by vegans as being the only trial that's proven to reverse heart disease.
Dean Ornish and colleagues demonstrated decades ago that our leading cause of death could be reversed. What appears to be the most effective diet for weight loss just so happens to be the only diet ever proven to reverse heart disease.
When actually it wasn't testing a plant-based diet at all. It was testing a whole range of interventions, of which a plant-based but not vegan diet was one of them. You see people like Michael Greger and Caldwell Esselstyn quoting this study all the time. The second type of study that's commonly used in support of veganism are the epidemiological studies, which look at large populations and see how their health progresses over time, whether they eat more meat or less meat. And these are hopelessly confounded by a couple of things. First, people that switch to a vegan diet tend to improve the quality of their diet generally. So that is, they tend to switch from a classic Western diet of quite a lot of junk food to generally more whole foods and more high quality food and more home cooked meals and all sorts of different variables, not just the fact that they eat less meat. And yet these studies are used to suggest that eating more meat is bad for you, when actually that's not what they're testing. They're just testing whether a Western type junk food diet is better than some other diet. And the thing is, the Western diet is the worst diet in the known universe. So almost any diet will look better than that in the short term at least. So I'm eager to see how this documentary deals with these problems. Anyway, I have my cup of tea. I'm going to sit down and enjoy the show. Here we go.
Research your own experience. Absorb what is useful. Reject what is useless, and what is specifically your own. Armed with this philosophy, I vowed to follow in Lee's footsteps. 15 years and 5 black belts later, I was given...
I think those last couple of scenes are really interesting. You know, he was just talking about Bruce Lee's philosophy of reject what is useless, and then we see him running into a fighting ring with all the sponsors on the floor, and the big sponsor in the centre is Burger King. This is absolutely key. This is what we're moving away from, is the junk food Western diet, the McDonald's and the Burger King. That is what makes a vegan diet look good.
That's when I stumbled across a study about the Roman gladiators.
Gladiators were predominantly vegetarian.
This totally blew my mind. The gladiators were highly prized fighters who got the most advanced training and medical care in the Roman Empire.
So wait a minute, he's suggesting that the gladiators had high strontium levels, high bone density because of their diet. But when you actually look at the reference itself says that a diet of barley and vegetables would have left the fighters with a serious calcium deficit. To keep their bones strong, historical accounts say they downed vile brews of charred wood or bone ash, both of which are rich in calcium. In other words, they had to supplement the diet because of its deficiency, not because of its mineral density. In the next paragraph it says, gladiators ate more plants and very little animal protein, but this had nothing to do with poverty or animal rights. Gladiators, it seems, were fat, consuming a lot of simple carbohydrates such as barley and legumes, like beans, was designed for survival in the arena. Packing in the carbs also packed on the pounds. Gladiators needed subcutaneous fat. A fat cushion prevents you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels in a fight. A lean gladiator would have been dead meat, it says. So I wonder if the documentary will go on to make this point, that actually the diet was consumed to help to fatten the gladiators and give them an insulation of high body fat, which is maybe not so relevant to athletes today. Okay, so he makes a point about the gladiators being, seasoned fighters, i.e., the first professional athletes, if you will. But it's not clear whether the gladiators actually had a choice in their diet. I've seen other interpretations saying that the gladiators were effectively slaves and they were fed a slave diet because they were just there for entertainment. Their lives were dispensable. But the reference itself does indeed say that they had a predominantly vegetarian diet. Of course, vegetarian is not vegan, and I really hope that the rest of the movie makes that delineation quite clear. So in this next section he goes on to discuss the ultramarathon athlete Scott Jurek, who's an ultra runner. Now this is interesting because my feeling for a while now has been that out of all the sports that are out there, ultra distance running is one of the few cases where a plant-based diet for significant periods of time may actually be beneficial for certain athletes, especially Caucasian males who tend to put on quite a lot of muscle. My suspicion has been that the low protein quality of plant protein will facilitate sarcopenia. It will facilitate the upper body muscle mass loss that's required to make your body light enough to be able to sustain that effort for such a long period of time. And if you look at Jurek on the race, I mean, he's just like most professional level distance runners. They are so thin in the upper body. Now, to a much lesser extent, I've also employed the same tactic very, very briefly. Just recently when I was trying to do a 9A called Hunger at the Anvil, and I'd gained quite a lot of muscle over the past few years, actually 4.5 kilos and more than a kilo in each leg. And in order to reverse some of that, to get myself, to lose some of the non-functional muscle that I didn't need, I just had far more than I needed. I actually employed a very short-term, low-protein vegan diet, eating only, or as much as possible, plant sources of protein. And because these are much less bioavailable, i.e. the protein goes in your mouth, but that doesn't mean it's available to your system. And also the balance of amino acids that are contained within that protein are not in the optimum ratio as they would be if you were eating another animal. And I do feel that for some Caucasian runners who are a little bit on the heavy side for professional elite level endurance running, and bear in mind that elite level sport does not equal health all the time. It actually can be quite unhealthy.
The actual energy for exercise comes mainly from carbohydrates in the form of glycogen that we store in our muscles. And when we sacrifice those carbohydrate calories for protein calories in our diet, what ends up happening is you will develop really chronic carbohydrate or glycogen depletion.
This is creating a misleading argument with respect to meat in the athlete's diet. It's true that you have to have energy as well as protein in the diet, but the energy can come from fat. It's absolutely true that if you don't eat enough carbohydrate to replenish your glycogen stores, then you will run into problems. But you can offset that by eating other types of energy like fat. And when you eat fatty meat, you're not just getting protein. You're getting protein plus a large amount of fat. You'd have to only be eating really lean protein, which is what bodybuilders do when they're trying to cut for their shows. So now we're seeing that Carl Lewis, one of the greatest athletes that ever has been, is a vegan. But actually, Carl Lewis switched to a vegan diet almost at the end of his career. And we're seeing quite a few different athletes in the movie already who are saying they're vegan, but they've only been vegan quite late in their career, i.e. they have built up to their elite level standard on an omnivorous diet and then switched to a vegan diet. And again, this comes back to this point about functional muscle mass. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that athletes can have a good anabolic response on an omnivorous diet, get to a high level of strength and fitness, and then trim back the non-functional muscle mass on a vegan diet, and by doing so reach a slightly improved level of performance, as I was saying that I have just done myself. And if they were to do that temporarily, periodically throughout their career, as some sports scientists have suggested, then I can see that being beneficial. But that's not the same as saying that switching to a vegan diet permanently will improve your performance, or that trying to develop an athlete from childhood onwards would be beneficial. We're not seeing any examples of that in film. So now we're introduced to this idea of animals as the middlemen, and that all protein ultimately comes from plants, and that if you just eat plants then you're cutting out the middleman. That's a nice kind of clickbaity idea, but it's totally oversimplistic. The idea of animals as a middleman, this is otherwise known as an ecosystem. And that's how trophic levels in ecosystems work. Herbivores who are at the bottom of trophic levels, who eat large amounts of plants, they are huge industrial plant processing machines, and they are also able to digest large amounts of plant material in a way that we just can't, because we don't have a huge bathtub sized vat, fermenting vat, in our many stomachs. We only have one stomach. We have a digestive system which is much closer to the carnivores than it is to the herbivores. So the herbivore strategy to get its protein from plants is to spend the entire day eating. And the apex predators, such as ourselves, eat the other animals. We eat the herbivores that upcycle the nutrients and concentrate the nutrients up the food chain, including the nitrogen in the protein. This idea is ridiculous.
In fact, the largest study to compare the nutrient intake of meat eaters with plant eaters showed that the average plant eater not only gets enough protein, but 70% more than they need.
I think we need to look that reference up. Okay, so the good thing about this documentary, to its credit, is it has the references on the screen so we can just check them. So I'm just looking at table 2 of the study. Now it's true that those total intakes of protein are above the minimum recommendations for staying alive, but that's literally all those guidelines are aimed at, is that it's a bare minimum. It's not necessarily reflective of an optimal, and this whole movie is about optimal performance, maximal athletic performance. He does go on to point out that athletes need more protein, to his credit, but then in this section he's talking about how the protein in a peanut butter sandwich or some lentils is equivalent to a given amount of steak or eggs. But there's no discussion so far, we'll give it a minute, on the protein digestion score. Because the problem with plant-based protein is it's not bioavailable. It's not as bioavailable as animal protein. So egg protein, for example, is known as a reference protein in that its bioavailability is as good as any other protein that's out there. And the digestibility of plant proteins, even the very best ones, is significantly behind most animal proteins. So in practice what that means is if the total protein intake of a meat eater and a strict vegetarian are both around 70 grams, the actual protein that's available to the body is going to be far less in the vegetarian, because we're talking about different bioavailability of that protein. Just because 70 grams of protein goes in your mouth does not mean that 70 grams is available for digestion and use by the body. It's just saying that because plant-based proteins are incomplete, that means the argument is that we're not going to get those amino acids, but that's not the argument at all. That's a misrepresentation of the argument. The argument is that we're not going to get all those amino acids in the right volumes at the same time. No one is arguing that there are not all the amino acids in the plants. That's just a misrepresentation. The point is that the amino acids must be consumed in the right balance in the same meal in order to be metabolized optimally by the body for all the functions that amino acids do in terms of repair and growth and optimal function and metabolism. As long as there's sufficient amino acids, the source is irrelevant, but the science does not reflect that. So there's a 1999 study, Campbell et al., that compared people training strength, consuming either a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet or an omnivorous diet with half of the protein coming from meat, and the meat eaters gained significantly more muscle. There's also another study from 2007 here showing that milk was better for muscle growth with the same protein intake from soy protein. And there are a series of other studies looking at this question of soy versus animal protein for muscle growth, and some of them are equivalent, but quite a few show significantly better muscle growth with animal protein. So like most nutritional scientific data, the picture is a little bit messy, but overall we can see that animal protein is at least equally as effective as plant protein, but in many studies it's actually significantly more superior.
Someone asked me, how could you get as strong as an ox without eating any meat? And my answer was, have you ever seen an ox eating meat?
Hang on, I've got to see that again.
Have you ever seen an ox eating meat?
He did actually say that. Oh my goodness. I mean, that is the kind of comment that if you see someone saying that kind of stuff in a gym, you just got to walk away. I mean, that's just ridiculous. It's the classic bro science thing of like, it's a basic idea which is it's oversimplified to the point where it doesn't make sense. An ox has 4 stomachs. It has a massive bathtub-sized fermenting vat in it. It requires that huge volume of bacteria in order to extract the energy from plants, and it converts that cellulose fibre that we cannot digest into fat. That's where it gets its energy from. And it can create high quality protein from the nitrogen in the plants by eating plants all day long, every day. We've gone back to the conclusion of the fight between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor. Now, I'm not really familiar with fighting, I don't follow it at all, but I do understand from just a quick search on the internet that Conor McGregor had to move up a couple of weight classes to fight Nate Diaz, and also that Nate Diaz is not vegan.
You are a really healthy guy. Are you still vegan?
I'm not 100% vegan. I eat eggs and I do weird stuff. Like I eat a little bit of fish from time to time, but I try not to. But when I train for fights, I'm pretty much on an all raw vegan diet.
Eat your vegetables.
And then what happens was I fight, I cut meat out for about a month. I take the fight. I come home and I eat some meat, like, all right.
So Brian Jennings is talking about how he'd hardly seen a vegetable as a kid, and he only found out what asparagus was a few years ago. And this to me gets at the heart of the vegan argument. We're talking about a lot of people who've moved from a standard American diet, the worst diet in the known universe, to a vegan diet. Of course we're going to see an improvement, because any diet would be an improvement on that. This says nothing about the comparison between a high quality omnivorous diet or even a carnivore diet versus a high quality vegan diet. This comparison has not been made yet in the movie, and it's the problem across the board with documentaries of this type that examine the efficacy of plant-based diets for health or performance. So they're trying to make the point here that your blood fats will be elevated if you eat meat.
Want to see your chicken? There it is.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
I mean, for one thing, there is nothing scientific about this experiment. The guy on the right has just finished telling us that he normally eats fried chicken on the way to a game. So he's on a junk food diet, and we're going to look at his triglycerides after a fatty meal. Can we really exclude the effect of the background junk food diet from the effect of the chicken burrito or whatever it was he was eating? It's true that having a lot of energy in the blood is a stressful thing for the system, and that large amounts of energy sitting in your blood can cause damage to the endothelium and is inflammatory in general. But the thing is, we already have a ton of science looking at what happens when people go on a prolonged high-fat, low-carbohydrate meat-based diet. And these blood markers almost universally go in the right direction. Fasting triglycerides reliably come down on a low-carb diet. Why? Because the body is using more fat in its metabolism. You're switching to a fat-based metabolism. So what you're seeing when you see these tests a couple of hours after the meal is a snapshot. It's the energy from the food, that fat in the food in transit from the gut to the tissues for storage, and then hopefully being used coming back out of storage to be metabolized in the peripheral tissues around the body. When people transition to a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, what we see is that their meal frequency tends to go down. So we're actually seeing less time in that postprandial state where energy is elevated in the blood. And the thing is that high glucose or fat in the blood both have damaging effects. If we look, for example, at what's happening to the glycocalyx, that's the fine layer of hairs, if you like, that line the endothelium in the blood vessels, they are damaged by high glucose. So you would see that sort of damage after a high carbohydrate meal. So we've just had this section comparing the benefits of animal versus plant protein. And again, it's just highly selective and misleading. They mention a series of chemicals that can come in with a diet with a meat-based meal. For example, they talk about endotoxin. However, endotoxin is associated with disruption of the gut barrier from a whole range of diets or conditions. And it's associated with gut disruption from a junk food diet. This is a product of a junk food diet generally, not just of meat. So if you have a disrupted gut barrier and the endotoxin from bacteria are able to escape into your system, then you will see elevated levels of inflammation. And it's true that when people switch to a plant-based diet, they can use that to improve that situation. Again, that's from cutting out the junk food that's damaging the gut lining. But people can also do that with the opposite diet, with a low residue meat-based diet. They also mention here heterocyclic amines, but this is dependent on the way the meat is cooked. And also when they refer to the plant-based protein, they talk about the other nutrients that come with it, fiber, vitamin C, flavonoids, lycopene, carotenoids. They don't mention any of the harmful things that come along with certain plant foods, things like goitrogens, things like oxalates, things like protease inhibitors. They don't mention any of the beneficial nutrients that come with meat, things like B12, things like retinol, things like EPA and DHA, things like the active form of B6, creatine, choline, or vitamin K2. So this is a false dichotomy they're creating here. I think with all of these examples of different athletes, we're really just going over and over the same flawed idea, which they present as when you go from an omnivorous diet containing meat to a plant-based diet, presumably vegan or near vegan, that your inflammation will go down, your strength will go up, your recovery will be improved, your risk of injury will go down. Many of the comments from these athletes give us clues to what's actually happening, which is they're just going from a low quality diet generally to a higher quality diet with an improvement in food quality. And we cannot say that it's the reduction in meat in the diet that's actually improving the situation for these athletes. So after the burrito experiment, there's a section where he talks about how Dr. Vogel's burrito experiment was backed up by numerous studies measuring how a single animal-based meal can impair blood flow. So just looking at a couple of those studies, it's just ridiculous. So one study, for example, from 2001 looks at postprandial, that is, in the digestive state, the post-meal state, hypertriglyceridemia, which just means high blood fats, impairs endothelial function by enhanced oxidant stress. So when you look at what the meal was, 100 grams of Korean barbecue. What's Korean barbecue? 8 grams of oil and 25 grams of mayonnaise. So if you think of the oil and the mayonnaise, we don't know what those were. I mean, if you look at most industrial mayonnaise products, they're basically made from vegetable oil, usually soybean oil or canola oil or something like that, which usually has a lot of linoleic acid, which has many papers exploring how they cause oxidative stress and endothelial damage. So from this study, we cannot conclude that this was anything to do with the fat or protein from the meat. It could easily come from the vegetable oil it was cooked in, which is a common theme across all the aspects that we're dealing with in this documentary. And if we look at a second study referenced here, the standardized high-fat meal consisted of whipping cream, liquid chocolate. So again, we're back to the idea that junk food...
Some hope at a firehouse in Brooklyn, where Dr. Esselstyn's son Rip, a former firefighter and professional triathlete, was launching some of New York's bravest on a powerful new program.
What's the #1 killer of firefighters in the line of duty? Heart attacks.
What's the #1 killer of vegetarians and vegans? Heart disease. We know with respect to heart disease is that when health-conscious omnivorous diets are compared with health-conscious vegan diets, there is no difference in longevity. Somewhat predictably, we've just had Dean Ornish talking about his study from a few decades ago. The idea is that a plant-based diet is the only diet ever to have reversed heart disease, except that is not the case at all. The study in question did not test a plant-based diet. It tested a whole range of things, including smoking cessation, stress relief, exercise, and a plant-based but not vegan diet. It really annoys me that in 2019 they're still bringing out this one study that was done decades ago and has been roundly criticised by many scientists for just this purpose, because it should not have been used as evidence to support a plant-based diet because it was not testing it. So now we're into this question of how can meat be so bad for you when humans have been eating it for such a long time, which is a fair question. And the first comment that's made is entirely true, which is that plants could be relied on as a source of calories at times where there was not higher quality food around. But that is the point, that humans were trying to hunt large animals. What we know from the fossil record is that as humans became more efficient hunters, we ate all the large megafauna. There was the era of the megafauna on the earth where the average size of mammals was hundreds of kilos, and actually in the period around 12,000 years ago when humans developed proper long-range spears, the average size of mammals dropped from 100 kilos, which had already dropped from an even higher level several tens of thousands of years before that. It dropped from 100 kilos to 10 kilos by the time we got to 10,000 years ago. And coincidentally, or actually not coincidentally, that is exactly when agriculture was started. So we basically ate all the megafauna and then switched to an agricultural diet. The idea that's put forward in opposition to what is being said here is that plants were used by humans, but they were used when there was not higher quality food around.
Humans do not have any specialized genetic, anatomical, or physiological adaptations to meat consumption.
Wait, what? Humans don't have any anatomical, physiological, or genetic adaptations to eating meat? Yes, they do. They have a brain, the largest brain in the animal kingdom, the largest brain in the universe, which is used for hunting large animals in a very organised way. We also have a physiology that's adapted to outrunning animals for long periods of time in the heat. This was used to do something called persistence hunting, where you run after an animal long enough where you don't catch it and you don't try to fight it, you just let it overheat until it can't run away anymore. We lost our fur and we gained the ability to sweat, which many other animals do not have. So we do have physiological adaptations for eating meat. You also only have to look at the human gut to realise that it's adapted to eating meat. The human gut is more acidic than even some of the scavengers.
We have longer digestive tracts than do carnivores, and this allows humans to digest plants and fibers that require longer...
Wait, 15 times body length? Where is this data coming from? We need to check this. So I'm just looking up this reference where they say that the human gut is 15 times our body length, whereas a carnivore's is only 4 times our body length, because that is in significant contrast to other papers that I have looked at on this issue.
And up to 39% of people tested, including meat eaters, are low in B12.
Oh, it's absolutely true that lots of omnivorous people in the West eating a Western diet are deficient in B12, but that's not an argument for eating less meat, that's an argument for eating more.
As a result, the best way for humans to get...
I mean, the rate of deficiency in B12 in vegans is controversial, depending on how you measure it, but it may be as high as in the 90% for vegans.
We also lack the ability to produce our own vitamin C. Vitamin C is found in plants, so the fact that we cannot make our own...
Vitamin C was first found in liver, actually, and we know that scurvy can be cured just by eating fresh meat. This is absolutely ridiculous. It's true that there's a lot less vitamin C in muscle meat, and actually if you look up tables of the vitamin C content of muscle meat, the figure given is often 0, but it's actually an assumed value. It's actually not 0, so if you're eating a large amount of muscle meat, then you're getting some vitamin C. Whether that's enough vitamin C on its own is still a matter of controversy. But the thing is, most people in the evolutionary human period would have eaten organ meats as well. They would have eaten liver, which has a much higher amount of vitamin C. And so this argument that about vitamin C made us rely on plants doesn't stand up.
Have a brain that just is desperate for glucose. It's such a fussy organ. That's the only thing it really takes in for energy. Well, meat's not a very good source of glucose.
Well, it's just not true that the brain only takes in glucose for energy. In the fasted state, it can run largely on ketones. The Cahill studies showed that 40, 50 years ago now. And the idea that glucose is the preferred fuel of the brain is something that you hear all the time. But this depends on what you mean by preferred. Preferred implies that glucose is the better fuel, but actually it could equally be argued, and I think it's a stronger argument, that glucose is preferred because the body has to use it. The body cannot store large amounts of glucose, therefore it has to use it. It has to be the high priority fuel because it has to be used first. That is not the same as saying that it's a better quality fuel.
Steak is for men. They showed us commercial. You got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality.
That's absolutely true. Marketing is marketing. But we are watching a film that's directed by a guy who owns the largest pea protein isolate factory in the world. We're watching a pea protein advert. So there's a bit of an irony there. I think one of the biggest problems I have with the idea of a plant-based diet is it allows people to say they're on a plant-based diet when they're actually not on a plant-based diet at all. Because what does plant-based actually mean? For most people, most people who are promoting the idea of a plant-based diet actually mean a vegan diet. But when they're referring to their own diet, they could be on something quite far from a vegan diet and get away with it, if you will. So in this documentary, we have Arnold Schwarzenegger, who, of course, built his athletic career on a quite heavily meat-based omnivorous diet, and then switched to a plant-based diet. But when you see other videos, you can see that he actually does still eat animal products. So he's even prepared to show us that he eats some animal products on camera.
What is it exactly that you want to see in the fridge? You just want to see the food? Or do you want to bust me because I'm not 100% vegan? Okay, a raw egg that we put in there. Well, actually, I like to put in the whole egg.
Do you cook at all?
Yeah, of course. My favorite thing to cook is, of course, steak. Well, a lot of times my bodybuilding friends come over to my kitchen or come over here to this office. And they want to, of course, eat the delicious food because they all want to look like me.
So what we don't know is what animal products he eats when he's off camera. Now, we may take it in good faith that Arnold Schwarzenegger is completely transparent and honest with us. Well, we just don't know that. The occasional bit of animal food, well, we just don't know what is meant by occasional. Occasional animal foods for a bodybuilder might not be that occasional. So now we've moved on to how the tobacco industry tried to hide the fact that smoking caused cancer, and how the meat industry have stepped up to the same game of hiding the harms of eating meat. But this is so ironic because what they're saying is that in the era of smoking, they used the good image, the positive image of professional athletes to promote the idea that smoking was healthy, and then they did the same with meat. But this is the same across the board for almost anything that the corporate world wishes to market. The athletes are used as pawns to market ideas if they're willing to participate in it. But this is exactly the same as what we're getting in this documentary. We're seeing an egregious misuse of science and the promotion in a very positive way of these plant-based athletes to try and promote an idea that is not backed by the scientific evidence. It's kind of amazing to me, and you know, I'm from the UK, and watching this documentary reminds me of the process that's gone on with Brexit in this country and the process that's gone on with Donald Trump in the US, where if they just make the bullshit brazen enough, they think that people will swallow it and not see it.
Overwhelming scientific evidence connecting animal foods to many of the most common deadly diseases.
There is not overwhelming evidence that animal foods are connected to deadly diseases. There's overwhelming evidence in epidemiology that the Western diet is linked to these diseases. And this is the same argument that goes round and round in the plant-based world, that they use epidemiology where people are eating their junk food, they're eating their meat in a McDonald's burger with the fries and Coke, but they're going to blame the meat because that fits the agenda they have. This is just wrong. It's just rubbish. And how much of this documentary is actually left? So we've just had a section looking at some of the dark corporate influences that are promoting the idea that meat is good for you and minimise, you know, as if they're trying to hide the data that plants are good for you in the name of profit. And of course that goes on. I think it would be ridiculous to deny that goes on. That is the business of the corporate world. It's to maximise profit. But the thing that is not mentioned in this documentary is exactly the same goes on with the plant-based diet, which the plant-based food industry is orders of magnitude larger than the meat industry. Why? Because plant foods in general are more shelf stable, they're cheaper to produce, they are much, much more profitable than meat. The state of the art in this movement is the Eat Lancet Commission, which has just travelled the world in private jets, by the way, launching their Eat Lancet Commission report, which recommends a largely plant-based diet.
You are the academic pioneers, political leaders, super successful entrepreneurs, civil society game changers.
And they recommend the increased use of nitrogen fertilisers, which require fossil fuels to be produced. Why? Because the sponsors of the Eat Lancet Commission are a who's who of big business, including Bayer, the company that bought Monsanto. These are massive global companies that produce very, very cheap, very, very profitable foods that are based largely on 3 ingredients: sugar, flour and vegetable oil. That makes up 60% of the calories in the American diet. The UK is very similar. These 3 ingredients are the trifecta of junk food in the Western world, and it's why there is so much money behind this. And David Katz, who you can see on the screen now, works for most of them.
I'm coming home at night and putting another animal on the fire, and I knew I was full of shit. I created this.
No, you're not full of shit. That's not how ecosystems work. This is really bizarre. So we've got this guy who's saying that he's out protecting the rhinos all day and he feels bad because he's coming home at night and he's eating a meal of meat. And really he ought to know that prey animals that are not predated on actually are harmed. They first expand by not having a natural predator, and then they're collapse because they expand to the point where they eat all their natural food supply. Predators are a natural part of ecosystems. That's how the whole system works. Because if we're worried about killing animals, shouldn't we worry about the animals that are killed in the process of industrial monocropping at scale, where the entire ecosystem is killed? You take a natural field that has trees and bushes and many different animals of all different types, from insects to small rodents to larger mammals to birds to all sorts of things, to large herbivores, and you sweep all of that away, till it, turn the soil, kill all the bacteria in the soil, and then plant one crop on top of it. And then in the process of harvesting, you're going to kill every insect, every rodent, either by displacing it or killing it directly. This is just ridiculous. I mean, where's the concern for those animals? Oh man, I can't believe you've gone back to this, what does a gorilla eat? This is the same as Patrick Baboumian was saying, does an ox ever eat meat? A gorilla has a completely different physiology from a human. It can digest plant food in a way that we can't. That's the bottom line. That's why we benefit from having animal foods in our diet. Yeah, sure, we can eat isolated pea protein in great concentration that has caused a great deal of environmental damage to farm. That is the purpose of this film, because the director owns a pea processing factory. But the idea that that actually fits better into the natural ecosystem that we should try to live within just doesn't make any sense. The environmental section of the film makes many of the classic misrepresentations of the arguments around meat in the human food supply. For starters, there's the argument about water, but the thing is, like, the cow needs only rainwater, sunlight and grass, which humans can't eat, to produce the highest quality food you can get. Also, it's true that large areas of the world are used for livestock production, but that's because large areas of the land surface of the world are unsuitable for crop production. The land is either too dry, too wet, too steep, too rocky. It's just unsuitable for crops, and that is why it's used for livestock. So it could not be swapped over to crop production. The argument that's generally follows is that, well, if you swap to plant production, then the land's area is reduced. But as the film has actually said, it takes much less land area to produce an equivalent number of calories from food. But food is more than just calories, and there are actually studies modelling this, that when you actually look at supplying all the nutrients, then the advantages with respect to both emissions and respect to land use as well from plant production disappear when you switch from a focus on calories to a switch on all the nutrients that we need to get from food. There's also the argument around emissions, and again that is also very misleading, because there are huge differences in the efficiency of the system in meat production in different areas of the world. These are avoidable problems that would bring down these emissions figures massively. And then there are also the arguments around carbon and the carbon cycle, and that the emissions that come from animals, from herbivores, which breathe out methane, that is carbon that they can only get from plants which sequester that carbon from the atmosphere. And therefore it's a cycle, and if you don't add any more herd, then you don't add any more warming. That's sometimes a difficult concept for people to get their head around. And actually herds in many countries have actually fallen as efficiency has risen, and the US is a good example of that. The dairy herd, for example, I think is about the same now as it was in the late 1800s, and it's fallen significantly over the past few decades as efficiency has risen. But none of these details fit the narrative that this documentary wants you to see, so that's why you don't see them. Another thing that's omitted from the documentary are the other athletes who were filmed from it but had to drop out because they stopped being vegan because of health problems, or that several of the athletes, including Patrick Baboumian and a couple of others, have actually been injured and have had long-term injuries or have had to retire in the period following them adopting a vegan diet. Well, I do think that people can go on a vegan diet and supplement it with things like pea protein and a whole list of other supplements, and can make this diet sustainable in the long term. I think most people are not going to do that, and they can take the message of this documentary that plants are inherently healthier, and they will not supplement the hell out of their diet, and they will start to have health problems. And even if you don't look at the scientific literature, even if you like to follow the documentaries, if you just follow many of the popular vegan YouTube channels, you will see that there's a very, very familiar pattern with many of them, which is that they start off by going from a Western junk food diet to a vegan diet and feel really good for the first year or two. And then their videos have a series of health problems that they're still trying to iron out over the next few years. And then once they reach the kind of 4 to 6 year mark, they one by one start to abandon the vegan diet. And there's actually blogs charting the progress of all of these channels. And usually it's only after the fact that we hear just how bad the problems that they've had with digestive problems, anxiety, depression, anabolic resistance, or just straight out muscle loss, sarcopenia.
I'm not vegan anymore, as you can probably tell by the title of this video.
Today I am going to share with you why I am no longer following a vegan diet.
Now looking back on it, I'm kind of like, why did we keep eating that way when, you know, obviously it wasn't getting better? But at the time we were making so many excuses for it, you know, being like, oh, well, maybe we're just not getting enough sleep, maybe we're not drinking enough water, maybe we're not doing this, this and this. And because we thought it was like the healthiest way you could possibly eat.
Don't be so boxed into one way of thinking that you're not able to see the signs early on. Throughout these years, I was genuinely doing what I felt was the best thing for my health.
So the first thing he started eating was some fish and eggs. He had fish twice a day for lunch and dinner and eggs for breakfast. And within about 5 days, all of his symptoms had cleared. Yeah, trying to wrap my head around that was one of the hardest weeks ever. Really big imbalance with my omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, an imbalance in my cortisol levels, and the main thing that he was concerned about, which was very high inflammatory markers.
I was vegan, completely vegan for over 6 years, and it's been 2 months since I started incorporating eggs and fish into my diet. Checked my hormone levels, and when I received the results, all of my hormones were out of whack. Something happened to me in my health that led me to have to try another thing.
I literally went from suffering to thriving.
In my race today, I'd got 192nd or 193rd or something. I was beaten by 19-minute 5k runners. I ran all my PBs as a 14-year-old when I wasn't even vegan. I've had 11 major injuries where I've been out for months on end. Before people say you didn't do it right, I was vegan for 3.5, 4 years. I tried every single version of veganism and I couldn't change how I felt. I still wake up in the morning feeling exhausted, skin condition, psoriasis, anxiety, depression, teeth rotting really fast in the past year.
Now, I would really love that this documentary would actually look at those people and examine what's going wrong with them, but of course it's not going to do that. Overall, I found this documentary really disappointing. It goes over the same ground that is common to most of the arguments you will find on many of the popular vegan websites. So is there anything positive to say about the film? Well, I think that most of the people in it are probably well-meaning, and I do admire the motivation to help people improve their health and to help improve the environment. And I do recognise that because the nutrition world has a lot of poor quality data in it, that navigating that maze can be quite challenging, and that some of the basic ideas that all you have to do is avoid meat and your problems will be solved, and also the world's problems will be solved, is a very attractive idea, and I'm sort of not surprised that people kind of go for it. The only other thing in positive that I would say about the film is that it's nicely filmed. So I'm going to finish by saying that I have started to work on a more detailed episode where I will go into my own reasons for not being vegan in a bit more of a detailed and systematic way, discussing quite a lot of different studies from the different fields, both in terms of general health, sport performance, environment and ethical concerns around eating meat. And overall, I think it underlines why watching Netflix documentaries to get your nutrition advice is a very risky strategy, and I think it'd be much better to read the original primary scientific literature yourself.